Hey everybody, welcome to our first lecture. So I'm excited to get started, jump right into the course material. And so the goal for today is really to have a discussion and start to introduce you to some of the topics we're going to cover today, and then also jump into the question of in the issue of defining terrorism. And we're going to try to get an understanding of how we think about this because this is a question, debate, issue that's going to come up throughout the term, and we're going to have to wrestle with on a number of occasions when we're trying to think about explain terrorism by trying to think of whether we can come up with a common definition. And as you'll see, there's a little foreshadowing. Your discussion question for your first position paper is going to be, should there be one universal definition of terrorism? So that's going to be your first position paper topic. Sorry, not your first discussion question. That's coming up here in a second. So we'll just jump in actually now and we'll move to what will be your first discussion question. And that is, when you hear the word terrorism, what are your initial thoughts? So take a second to think about that. This is what you're going to post about in the first discussion question section on the discussion question boards. And you're going to have a novel post as well as respond to somebody else. So think about this. What do you associate with terrorism? There are a whole range of different things that you could think about and apply to this particular question. I mean, just to start to give an example, I can think of my first experience, thought, association with terrorism. We can think to, or I think to the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta when there was a pipe bomb that blew up. And that's my first memory of terrorism. But it's evolved since then. We've had lots of experiences with terrorism, what it means, different types of terrorism. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think about it in terms of, do you think about 9/11? For a lot of Americans, 9/11 is a major element of their lives and what they think about when they think about the word terrorism. But then we also have to think about it in other contexts. We have to think about it in terms of whether we're going to consider when we think about state violence as a means of terrorism. We have to think about what it means when we think about the death of someone like George Floyd as an example of state terrorism, and what it means when we think about whether military and police forces are capable of terrorism. And so we're going to talk about state terrorism as a particular topic, and we need to think about it in the context not only just of authoritarian regimes, but in the long history of the United States as well. So just giving you some ideas there to think about, to get your discussions and thoughts flowing about what you think about when you hear the word terrorism. And I want you to think about this because I want to start with this question because it's important, I think, to assess our initial perceptions, see where we're starting from, and then I want to use this as a baseline for as you progress through the class. As we cover different topics, how does your thinking about terrorism progress? How does it change? How does it evolve over time? And I want you to keep this, and refresh back and think about this because in the final class, one of your discussion questions is going to be the same question, but modified slightly. It's going to be asking you, what are your thoughts about terrorism now when you hear the term? So keep that in mind. So again, your discussion question one is, I'll go back real quick. When you hear the word terrorism, what are your initial thoughts? Again, that's your first discussion question. So what are we going to do in this class? I want to pivot now to think about some of our objectives. So we've got a lot of things we're going to cover, and I'm not even going to be able to highlight them all here briefly, but just to sort of give you some ideas. And I covered some of the objectives as well in the syllabus review that I did. So you can look there as well to see some other objectives, broad objectives. And if you also look through the syllabus readings, you'll get a good understanding of what we're going to be focusing on as well. So we're going to start out, we're going to try to define terrorism. We're going to think about that, wrestle with the difficulties of trying to come up with a definition of terrorism. And our case study a little bit later in the second video you're going to have to watch is going to be focused on trying to understand the consequences and the difficulties of the international community trying to arrive at a singular definition of terrorism. So this is going to be a major thing we focus on in the class. We're going to consider the explanations for terrorism. We're going to try to understand why individuals and groups engage in terrorist acts, why they commit these particularly heinous acts of violence, and what their goals are and what drives them to actually do that. So we're going to delve into a lot of factors. We're going to try to understand the political motivations, psychological motivations, whether we even think terrorism is a rational act. We're also going to try to understand U.S. policy on terrorism. We're going to try to see the U.S. experience with terrorism going back into the past and moving up to the present. We're going to look at it in terms of non-state actors as well as state actors. So we say that we think about individuals who are not part of the government, but then also looking at how various elements of the U.S. government have used terrorism in the past, especially when we look at the American South during segregation, and then even concerns, as I said, we have today with the capacity for police forces to potentially institute terrorism. So this is what we have to think about when we think about U.S. policy on terrorism. And then we also want to investigate how terrorism ends. Is there a way for us to reach a point where we don't have to deal with terrorism anymore? And this is, of course, I'm phrasing this in the broadest context possible, but we'll look at this in various ways. We'll look at, when is it possible for military solutions to help curb or end terrorism? When do diplomatic solutions come into play to help resolve the issue? Do we reach a point where, terrorist groups give up? Why do they give up? What are some of the reasons for that? We'll look at the prospects for government change as a way to end terrorist movements. So these are a lot of things we're going to think about and focus on throughout the course when we're trying to delve into this topic of political terrorism. So the next thing I want to do is get to your second discussion question. And this is, I think, a good way to launch into our discussion and our goal here of contemplating and thinking about how we define terrorism. Well, for your second discussion question 2, I ask you, how do you define terrorism? Again, discussion question 2, how do you define terrorism? So what I recommend you doing here is pausing the video and maybe jotting down some ideas you have before we even start to talk about it a little bit more. I want you to think about this without even potentially being influenced maybe by what I'm about to cover. So if you can, pause it, jot down, briefly what you think might be your definition of terrorism. So now that you've done that, I want you to think about various elements of the definition of a definition of terrorism. How do we go about trying to construct it? So we have to think about it from a number of ways, right? One of the first ways that a lot of scholars have tried to address the issue, and what I think we need to focus on a lot, is asking ourselves and asking the question, what is terror, right? It's a key component of the word. It seems to be a fundamental aspect of how we think about this particular action. And then we have to think about what types of actions constitute terrorism. We're going to wrestle with this all throughout the course. Do kidnappings constitute terrorism? Do bombings that only target buildings that don't try to kill anybody constitute terrorism? Do people have to die for an act to be considered terrorism? We're going to have to ask ourselves a lot of questions about what types of actions actually constitute terrorism, and can we come to a singular definition where we can identify every type of action that we think constitutes terrorism? And then we're going to have to think about the motives behind it. Are there certain motives that drive violence that constitute terrorism, and when is this potentially not the case? We got to think about and this sometimes we can drift us into thinking about the targets. So who do we think about has to be the target for something to be an act of terrorism? And this becomes a particular issue when we try to separate out terrorism from warfare, right? If we're trying to draw a line and distinguish between the two, do we say terrorism only targets civilians, and if we're thinking about warfare, we're only targeting military forces. Well, this raises a lot of questions, right? We think about the fact then, does that mean that if the Taliban blows up a bomb at a U.S. Army base in Afghanistan, does that constitute terrorism, or is that warfare? Or we ask ourselves, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing estimated 135, 150,000 people in 1945, specifically targeting civilians. We have to ask ourselves, does that constitute terrorism? It's not a military target. They're not targeting military personnel. They targeted civilians. Is that an act of terrorism? So we really have to ask questions about who are the targets, who's carrying out the actions. Again, as I said, or gave a preview earlier, do we think states can be perpetrators of terrorism, or is it only non-state actors? We'll have a whole discussion about state terrorism and try to delve into this question more. And then we also have to think about the consequences, right? Is something an act of terrorism if an actual tragic event doesn't happen? So there are a number of instances that have happened in the past where suicide bombers have tried to kill themselves and they don't actually succeed in blowing up their vest. Nobody dies. Do we consider that an act of terror, right? We have to wonder that everyone then knows that this individual tried to kill themselves if they were stopped by the police or something along those lines. Does that constitute an act of terror if something doesn't actually happen? And then, as we said, the consequences, do we have to think about, do people have to die? Does it have to be property damage? What do the consequences have to be for it to fit into this category of terrorism? And so, as you can gather from the way I'm discussing it here, there are a lot of difficulties when it comes to trying to come up with one universal definition of terrorism. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should abandon the prospect. I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to emphasize at the outset, I think the difficulties are of trying to come to a unified definition, especially when we have to factor in and we have to consider how so many different perspectives may shape the way people actually go about defining the term. So what I thought I'd do is show you several definitions of terrorism. There's a scholar who tried to collect as many definitions of terrorism as he could. I think he collected around 250 or so, roughly since the 1800s. Academics, politicians, international organizations, law enforcement agencies, to try to get us an understanding of how individuals, how scholars, how groups, people, leaders, political leaders have thought about trying to define terrorism. So but for each one, I'll discuss it a little bit, but I also want you to pause and think a little bit about what might be some shortcomings. So the first definition that I want to give you is this the year is not known for this definition, and it's from an uncredited source, but the idea here is, the definition is kill one, frighten 10,000. So pause there for a second. Think about some of the benefits and shortcomings of this definition. So, hopefully you've paused, thought about it for a second. What are some benefits? Well, maybe we would say it really goes right to the element of thinking about terror, right? Frighten is built into the definition. Kill one, frighten 10,000. So really getting at this idea of the goal is not just about killing a single individual, right? It's about instituting and instilling fear in a broader population. So I think this is a really solid element of this definition. But then we have a lot of questions too, right? It says nothing about who the target is. It says nothing about whether there are particular types of motivation. Does it tell us anything about the type of conflict that is occurring? Does it tell us? So it gets into some of the consequences, which I think is an important element, but we are left wanting in certain elements, right? It starts to hint at the idea that we'll get to here in a little bit about the importance of thinking about terrorism as what we would call a communication strategy, right? As a way to deliver a particular message. But this doesn't really even say necessarily that the goal is to deliver a particular message. It says kill one, frighten 10,000. And suppose you could implicitly say frighten 10,000 to carry out a message, but it doesn't say that. So that's another shortcoming I think we could think about. So I think this is a good place to start, though. All right, let's think about definition number 2. So this is from 1966, a scholar named Aaron. This individual wrote, an action of violence is labeled terrorist when the psychological effects are out of proportion to its purely physical result. In this sense, the so-called indiscriminate acts of revolutionaries are terrorist, as were the Anglo-American zone bombings. The lack of discrimination helps to spread fear, for if no one in particular is a target, no one can be safe. So pause there for a second. Think about what you think some positives for this definition are, what some negatives are. So I think what we can say here when we think about this is, again, a positive is getting at this focus on the psychological effects, right? The idea that the weight of the attack maybe carries beyond even just what the initial attack was, right? It's not just the loss of life or the property damage that occurred. It's the lingering effects of that. So I think that's important. And getting at this idea that it continues to affect people. It instills this idea of terrorism, and he says it helps to spread fear because it's the idea that no one in particular is a target, no one can be safe. So it's prevalent, it's persistent. We always have to be concerned about it. And it's an indiscriminate, indicating that we don't know when the next time something's going to occur, right? Uncertainty is built into this definition. I think that's a benefit. But then we start to wonder, and we ask, so it says the indiscriminate acts of revolutionaries are terrorists. So we have to ask ourselves, are all revolutionaries terrorists? Well, what are the circumstances of which they're rebelling? If a group of people lives in an extremely authoritarian regime and they begin to carry out attacks against a government that tortures, imprisons, kidnaps, are they freedom fighters? We have to ask these questions, right? We need to think about whether we can just simply say all revolutionaries are terrorists. We have to think about how we're even defining our terms within a particular definition. So think about that. Try to come up with some more, perhaps benefits, shortcomings you see in this definition. Next one. We have from Adicott in 2009. This individual said, if a universal definition is not practicable, one can at least list 4 key characteristics of terrorism that better reflect the activity. 1. The illegal use of violence directed at civilians to produce fear in a target group. 2. The continuing threat of additional future acts of violence. 3. A predominantly political or ideological character of the act. 4. The desire to mobilize or immobilize a given target. Okay, so let's think about this. Pause it, think about the positives and negatives. All right, so let's think about this. So again, we're getting back to, there seems to be this common thread we're seeing, right, across a lot of these definitions. Fear, terror, uncertainty being a key component to defining what terrorism is, to thinking about what constitutes an act of terror. There needs to be this uncertainty, this fear that lingers on and is persistent, right? That's an important element. But they also go into emphasize that it can't just be indiscriminate, right? It has to be for a particular purpose. And this is an interesting thing to think about, because if we think about individuals just simply carrying out an act of violence to carry out an act of violence, or for a motive, say, extremely personal, without perhaps a political or ideological motivation, well, that could be an important thing for us to think about when we distinguish terrorism, right? We think about a goal. We think about the individuals carrying out these acts having an aspiration, something they want to achieve. And I think that's might be an important thing to think about. That we think that it's not simply an indiscriminate act that has no purpose that it wants to actually carry out and achieve. So that's important to think about. And then it says this, I think it's an interesting element, the desire to mobilize or immobilize a given target group. So here we also have to think about, right, there's no specific issue of addressing the type of target, right? Whether we can think about whether we have non-state actors carrying out attacks against the state, and if we think about as carrying attacks out against military personnel, do those count as acts of terror in this definition? Well, it's not distinguishing between who the targets have to be, and I think that's an important thing we have to think about if we're going to try to distinguish terrorism from warfare. So that's one potential negative we could see in this definition. So again, I think it'd be helpful for you to take a moment, think about some more positives and negatives, and then let's look at one last definition. This is from English in 2009. And this is: terrorism involves heterogeneous violence used or threatened with a political aim. It can involve a variety of acts, of targets, and of actors. It possesses an important psychological dimension, producing terror or fear among a directly threatened group and also a wider implied audience in the hopes of maximizing political communication and achievement. It embodies the exerting and implementing of power and the attempted redressing of power relations. It represents a subspecies of warfare, and as such, it can form part of a wider campaign of violent and nonviolent attempts at political leverage. So pause it for a second here. Try to jot down some positives and negatives. So I think this is a pretty good definition in a lot of respects. This gets at a lot of the issues we are talking about, right? So it addresses the issue of fear right off the bat and the importance that the act itself is not just the end goal, right? It's the motive, it's the political aim, and it's also the communication strategy of pushing a particular agenda through the use of violence in a particular way, right? So that's an important thing. It tries to then also thread the needle and mend the fences between this idea of trying to distinguish between terrorism and warfare, right? It says it constitutes a subspecies of warfare. But we could also ask questions about that, right? Do we lump terrorism in with warfare, or is it something different? We think about, and as happened after World War II, even before that, there have been lots of attempts to codify how wars are actually carried out. Conventions against the use of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, things like this, right? But when we think about terrorism, right, we oftentimes think about it as not necessarily being governed by rules. And so we have to ask questions there. Does terrorism really constitute a subspecies of warfare? And so this is something I think we have to think about and wrestle with in this particular definition. Then also, by saying subspecies of warfare, again, we're starting to blur and it's not laying out clearly who the particular target has to be. Again, we constantly get into this issue of civilians versus military personnel. This is an important thing to think about and to consider when we're considering all these definitions of terrorism. So I'm going to leave it there. As I said, you have a case study next. We're going to be talking and thinking about trying to build a common universal definition and some struggles that the United Nations has faced in trying to come up with a agreed upon definition of terrorism. So we'll dig into that in our case study next. Thanks everybody for listening. Talk to you again soon.